On the morning of August 7, 1942, at precisely 0640 hours, Private Arthur Hensley crouched in a defensive position on Guadalcanal's northern beaches, gripping a weapon that represented New Zealand's desperate attempt to field automatic rifles when industrial capacity and shipping priorities made obtaining purpose-built weapons nearly impossible. The rifle in his hands was fundamentally a Lee-Enfield No. 1 Mark III, the standard British bolt-action rifle that had served throughout World War I and remained in frontline service during World War II, but it had been extensively modified by New Zealand engineers to incorporate a gas-operated automatic firing mechanism, converting the manually operated bolt action into a select fire weapon capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. The Charlton Automatic Rifle, as this conversion was designated, weighed approximately 5.8 kilograms compared to the standard Lee-Enfield's 4.1 kilograms, featured a 30-round detachable box magazine extending below the receiver, and represented both impressive engineering ingenuity and the fundamental limitations inherent in retrofitting automatic fire capability onto a weapon platform never designed for such operation. At 25 years of age, Hensley had served 9 months with the New Zealand's 2nd Division and received the Charlton Automatic during July 1942, approximately 1 month before the Allied landings on Guadalcanal that would mark the beginning of offensive operations in the Pacific Theater. His training with the weapon had been abbreviated, barely 3 weeks of familiarization firing and tactical exercises, because the urgency of deploying forces to combat operations left minimal time for thorough training on equipment that had itself been rushed into production to address critical capability gaps. The Lee-Enfield rifle that formed the basis of the Charlton conversion was a weapon with distinguished service history dating to the 1890s. The No. 1 Mark III variant that saw extensive use during World War I and remained in service during World War II featured a 10-round internal magazine fed by stripper clips, a smooth bolt action capable of rapid manipulation by trained soldiers, and robust construction that maintained reliability under harsh field conditions. The rifle fired the .303 British cartridge, a rimmed rifle round that had been the standard British service cartridge since 1889. However, by 1940, the tactical environment had evolved substantially from the conditions that had shaped the Lee-Enfield's original design. The Spanish Civil War, the invasion of Poland, and the Battle of France had all demonstrated that automatic weapons, both submachine guns for close-quarters combat and automatic rifles or light machine guns for squad-level support, provided critical tactical advantages in modern warfare. Infantry squads that could deliver sustained automatic fire could suppress enemy positions more effectively, respond to threats more rapidly, and maintain fire superiority during mobile operations where the time required to operate bolt-action rifles created dangerous gaps in defensive coverage. The British Army recognized these requirements and had developed the Bren light machine gun to provide squad-level automatic fire capability. However, the Bren's manufacturing complexity, its weight and bulk, and the limited production capacity available during 1940-1942 meant that Bren guns remained in insufficient supply to equip forces at the scales that tactical doctrine suggested were optimal. Commonwealth nations like New Zealand, Australia, and Canada faced even greater shortages as their forces had lower priority for equipment allocation compared to British units defending the homeland against potential invasion. New Zealand's strategic situation during 1941-1942 was particularly acute. The nation faced potential Japanese invasion following the December 1941 attacks on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent rapid Japanese advance through Southeast Asia.
New Zealand military planners recognized that defending against invasion would require infantry forces capable of delivering automatic fire at squad level. But obtaining sufficient Bren guns or American Browning automatic rifles through normal procurement channels was impossible given global equipment shortages and shipping constraints. The solution that emerged was the Charlton Automatic Rifle, developed by New Zealand engineer Philip Charlton during 1941. Charlton's insight was that the fundamental components necessary for automatic fire, a gas system to cycle the action and a mechanism to control firing mode, could be retrofitted onto existing Lee-Enfield rifles, converting bolt-action weapons already in New Zealand's inventory into automatic rifles without requiring the nation to manufacture entirely new weapons or depend on imports from industrial centres thousands of kilometres distant. The Charlton conversion incorporated several major modifications to the standard Lee-Enfield platform. A gas cylinder and piston were installed beneath the barrel, positioned to capture propellant gases through a port drilled into the barrel approximately 20 centimetres from the muzzle. The gas pressure drove the piston rearward, and this rearward motion was transmitted through a connecting rod to the bolt carrier, which extracted the fired cartridge and cycled a fresh round from the magazine. The magazine system required substantial redesign. The Lee-Enfield's internal 10-round magazine fed from stripper clips and was integral to the rifle's receiver. The Charlton conversion eliminated this system entirely, replacing it with a detachable 30-round box magazine that inserted from below the receiver in a configuration similar to the Bren gun. The magazine well required extensive modification to the Lee-Enfield stock and receiver area, fundamentally altering the weapon's appearance and handling characteristics. The fire control mechanism incorporated a selector switch that allowed the operator to choose between semi-automatic fire, 1 round per trigger pull, and fully automatic fire that continued as long as the trigger remained depressed and ammunition remained in the magazine. The cyclic rate during automatic fire was approximately 500 to 550 rounds per minute, comparable to purpose-built light machine guns of the era. However, these modifications came with substantial costs in weight, balance, reliability, and compatibility with the Lee-Enfield platform's fundamental design characteristics. The gas system, connecting rod, modified receiver, and heavier components necessary to withstand the stresses of automatic fire added approximately 1.7 kilograms to the weapon's weight. The center of gravity shifted forward due to the gas cylinder and heavier barrel components, altering the weapon's natural pointing characteristics and making rapid target acquisition more difficult. More fundamentally, the Lee-Enfield's design incorporated features that were well suited for bolt-action operation, but problematic for automatic fire. The .303 British cartridge rimmed case design, for instance, worked adequately when loaded into the Lee-Enfield's internal 10-round magazine, where cartridges were carefully stacked to prevent rim interference. However, the rimmed cases created feeding problems in the detachable box magazines that the Charlton conversion employed, as improper stacking could cause the rim of one cartridge to catch behind the rim of another, producing feeding failures that jammed the weapon. The Lee-Enfield's rear locking bolt design, where the locking lugs were positioned at the bolt's rear near the receiver rather than forward near the chamber, was another feature optimized for bolt-action operation that created complications when adapted for automatic fire. The long bolt throw required for this design meant that the reciprocating mass had to travel a greater distance during each firing cycle, increasing the time required per cycle and creating stronger reciprocating forces that affected weapon stability during automatic fire.
Hensley's training period during July 1942 had revealed these characteristics through direct experience. The Charlton was substantially heavier than the Lee-Enfield he had trained with during basic instruction, and the forward weight bias made the weapon more fatiguing to carry and slower to bring to shoulder. The automatic fire capability was impressive when the weapon functioned properly, but feeding failures occurred with distressing frequency, approximately 1 malfunction per 30 to 40 rounds fired, representing a reliability rate substantially inferior to purpose-built automatic weapons like the Bren gun.
The feeding failures typically manifested as failure to feed malfunctions, where the bolt failed to strip a fresh cartridge from the magazine, or as failure to chamber malfunctions, where the cartridge entered the chamber at an improper angle and could not be fully seated. Clearing these malfunctions required the operator to remove the magazine, manually cycle the action to clear any partially fed cartridge, reinsert the magazine, and chamber a fresh round, a process consuming 10 to 15 seconds during which the weapon was inoperative. The weapon's accuracy during automatic fire proved mediocre even by the standards of automatic rifles. The reciprocating bolt's long travel created substantial vibration that disturbed aim, and the forward weight bias combined with the relatively light overall weight meant that muzzle climb during sustained fire was pronounced. Effective automatic fire required short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds rather than sustained fire, and even disciplined burst fire achieved only marginal accuracy beyond approximately 100 meters. However, the Charlton did provide genuine tactical capability that the standard Lee-Enfield could not match. The ability to deliver automatic fire, even inaccurate automatic fire, allowed suppression of enemy positions at ranges and rates that bolt-action rifles simply could not achieve. A Charlton gunner could deliver 90 rounds per minute during sustained firing, accounting for magazine changes and brief cooling pauses, compared to the 15 to 20 rounds per minute that even highly trained soldiers could achieve with bolt-action Lee-Enfields. The Guadalcanal landings on August 7, 1942, represented Hensley's first combat employment of the Charlton Automatic. The New Zealand forces participating in the operation had been issued a mix of weapons, including standard Lee-Enfield rifles, a limited number of Bren guns, Thompson submachine guns for officers and specialists, and approximately 40 Charlton automatics distributed to provide squad-level automatic fire capability where Bren guns were not available. The initial landings encountered minimal Japanese resistance, as the majority of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were concentrated inland rather than defending the beaches. However, Japanese forces began counterattacking almost immediately, and by the morning of August 8th, Hensley's unit was engaged in defensive operations against Japanese infantry attempting to dislodge the Allied beachhead. The first engagement where Hensley employed the Charlton in combat occurred at approximately 6:45 hours when Japanese forces attacked his section's position from concealed positions in jungle vegetation approximately 80 meters distant. The attack developed rapidly, with Japanese soldiers advancing in small groups while other elements provided covering fire with rifles and light machine guns. Hensley's section leader directed him to provide suppressive fire against the Japanese positions, while other section members maneuvered to flanking positions. Hensley set the Charlton selector to automatic fire, settled the weapon against his shoulder with the bipod deployed on sandbags that provided a stable firing platform, and pressed the trigger. The weapon discharged approximately 8 rounds in rapid succession before experiencing a feeding failure that halted firing.
The malfunction was a failure to feed, with the bolt locked rearward and no cartridge in the chamber. Hensley executed the malfunction clearance procedure, dropping the magazine, cycling the action manually, reinserting the magazine, and chambering a fresh round, consuming approximately 12 seconds during which Japanese fire continued impacting around his position. The second firing attempt produced approximately 15 rounds before another feeding failure occurred. This pattern repeated throughout the engagement, with the Charlton delivering automatic fire in bursts interrupted by frequent feeding failures that required time-consuming clearance procedures. Despite these interruptions, the automatic fire capability allowed Hensley to suppress Japanese positions more effectively than would have been possible with a bolt-action rifle. The volume of fire, even delivered in interrupted bursts, forced Japanese soldiers to take cover and disrupted their advance, contributing to the section's successful defense of its position. However, the engagement also revealed the Charlton's limitations compared to purpose-built automatic weapons. A Bren gunner in an adjacent position maintained more consistent fire with fewer malfunctions, delivering more effective suppression while consuming ammunition at comparable rates. The Bren's superior reliability meant that the gunner could focus on target engagement rather than malfunction clearance, maintaining continuous pressure on enemy positions rather than cycling between firing and troubleshooting. The engagement concluded after approximately 25 minutes when Japanese forces withdrew after failing to break through the Allied defensive line. Hensley had expended approximately 130 rounds through the Charlton, experiencing 7 feeding failures that had consumed cumulative time exceeding 1 minute. His assessment was that the weapon had contributed to the defensive success but had demanded constant attention to reliability problems that distracted from the tactical employment. The days following the initial landings saw repeated Japanese counterattacks as both sides reinforced their positions and fought for control of Henderson Field, the airstrip whose capture had been the primary objective of the Allied operation. Hensley employed the Charlton during 4 additional engagements over the subsequent week, accumulating experience with the weapon's characteristics and developing techniques to minimize feeding failures. He learned that careful magazine loading could reduce malfunction rates. The rimmed .303 cartridges had to be positioned precisely in the magazine to prevent rim-over-rim interference, requiring attention during loading that detachable box magazines for rimless cartridges did not demand. Magazines loaded hastily under stress produced feeding failures at rates approaching 50%, while carefully loaded magazines might function for entire 30-round capacities without malfunction. He learned that the gas system required frequent adjustment to maintain reliable cycling. Carbon fouling accumulated in the gas port and cylinder, and variations in ammunition quality meant that gas pressure varied between different lots of cartridges. The Charlton incorporated a gas regulator that could be adjusted to increase or decrease gas flow, but finding optimal settings required experimentation and continuous monitoring as fouling accumulated during sustained firing. He learned that the weapon's weight and balance made it unsuitable for mobile operations where rapid movement and frequent position changes were required. The Charlton worked adequately from prepared positions where the bipod could be deployed on stable surfaces, but carrying the weapon during movement and attempting to fire from hasty positions produced poor results. The forward weight bias and reciprocating forces during automatic fire made accurate shooting from unsupported positions nearly impossible.
These lessons characterize the experiences of other New Zealand soldiers employing Charlton automatics during the Guadalcanal campaign. The weapons provided automatic fire capability that was better than no automatic fire capability, but they demanded constant attention to reliability issues and worked best in prepared defensive positions rather than during mobile operations. The consensus that emerged from field employment was that the Charlton was an adequate expedient that addressed critical capability gaps, but that remained clearly inferior to purpose-built automatic weapons designed from inception for automatic fire. The production history of the Charlton Automatic reflected New Zealand's limited industrial capacity and the weapon's role as an interim solution pending availability of better alternatives. Approximately 1,500 Charlton conversions were completed between mid-1941 and late 1942, utilizing Lee-Enfield rifles from New Zealand military stocks. Production involved disassembling existing rifles, manufacturing and installing the gas system and magazine well modifications, and testing the converted weapons before issue to troops. However, production ceased during late 1942 as improved supply situations allowed New Zealand forces to obtain Bren guns and other purpose-built automatic weapons through normal procurement channels. The strategic situation had stabilized sufficiently that New Zealand no longer faced imminent invasion threat, and the Charlton's role as an emergency capability became less critical as Commonwealth industrial production expanded and shipping capacity increased. The Charlton automatics already in service remained with some units through 1943, but most were withdrawn during that year as Bren guns became available in sufficient quantities to provide squad-level automatic fire without depending on converted rifles.
Some Charltons were retained for Home Guard and reserve forces in New Zealand, where their limitations were considered acceptable for second-line troops who would employ them in defensive positions if invasion occurred. However, the majority were either returned to standard Lee-Enfield configuration or scrapped during post-war demobilization. The weapon's broader significance extended beyond its limited production and brief service life. The Charlton demonstrated that automatic fire capability could be retrofitted onto bolt-action rifles through gas-operated conversions, providing a pathway for nations with limited industrial capacity to field automatic weapons using existing rifle stocks rather than developing entirely new weapons. This concept influenced several other wartime conversions, including Australian efforts to create automatic rifles from existing weapons and various expedient modifications undertaken by resistance forces operating with limited access to military equipment. However, the Charlton also demonstrated the limitations of such conversions. The fundamental characteristics of the Lee-Enfield platform, its rimmed cartridge, rear-locking bolt, and receiver geometry all created complications when automatic fire was introduced. The modifications required to address these complications added weight and complexity while still producing a weapon inferior to designs conceived from inception as automatic rifles. The conversion was possible and produced functional weapons, but the results validated the conventional wisdom that optimal weapons required design integration rather than retrofit modification. Arthur Hensley survived the Guadalcanal campaign, though wounds sustained during fighting in October 1942 resulted in his medical evacuation to New Zealand and eventual discharge from military service in early 1943. His Charlton Automatic was turned in when he left his unit, likely remaining in service with other soldiers before eventual withdrawal during the Bren gun re-equipment program.